Well, I couldn't say something that kind of combines that with your big question of what's education for, which is maybe something about my own position on it, which I think has some sense of relationship with British architectural culture, but also with my own position, where I think what I look for in architectural education and what I think is important is a sense of relevance. And I think that can have kind of real multiplicity of readings, different kind of readings. I don't mean relevance in an overly kind of limiting manner, but I do think relevance in a way that is the opposite of irrelevance.
Maybe not fashion?
Maybe not fashion in the way that fashion's often regularly used, but that's not to kind of close fashion off as a kind of extraordinary interesting field in itself, which actually can have a relevance, I think. But yes, perhaps not in the way that fashion's fashionable, maybe. But I think students can have a sense of relevance in, I suppose, architecture and architects' a license to make change, change the world. And I kind of look for, in architectural schools, in architecture students, for that kind of curiosity and willingness, a curiosity to kind of scratch and find where their agency to make change and to kind of be relevant out in the world is, whether that's in a small way or a big way, whether they think they can, because students, they get all sorts of different students, and what's right for one is not right for all, and some might want to make small change and someone might want to be the next William Morrison.
And does that come from your education? Because I often feel that you teach as well, and I feel that as teachers, for example, we both embody our teachers, our own teachers, but we also could try to correct them, because we obviously see that some things were not taught in the right way or the right things. And so I wonder, how were you taught? Like, what's your relationship to your own education?
I studied in the University of Edinburgh for my part 1 and my part 2. I studied from the late 80s to the early 90s. My timing was kind of slightly funny and slightly frustrating in retrospect, in that when I was in the lower school, we had a remarkable professor, Izzy Metzstein, from the practice Gillespie Kidd and Coyer. Unfortunately, he taught in the upper school primarily, and while I was on my year out, he left and retired, and I came back and he wasn't there to teach me. So it was frustrating in many ways. He was a kind of brilliant modernist of the 50s to 80s in Scotland. And so I missed out of that, and it was kind of frustrating. And I think to some extent, when I look back on my education and what I get from it, with no disrespect to the people who taught me, it was a kind of independent space where I found my own learning. I visited the library and I spent time, and I was discovering my own things. And I think great,
incredibly valuable.
Exactly, and I think great for that. And there were certain moments in that, which I'll come back to in a moment, which were hugely valuable for me, and I still hold on to it as key parts of my education, but they were kind of self-directed a bit. And I think that was a hugely valuable and a real privilege that I had, which is somehow associated with kind of free state-funded education, where there wasn't the pressure that comes with funding, either to have alternative jobs in parallel or to feel that because of the economics involved, one has to kind of intensely produce, but actually there was a kind of freedom to be creatively unproductive as well, I think, which I look back on, and I think that's something that certainly in Britain doesn't exist now in any school. And then I suppose specifically, it was the late 80s and early 90s, towards the second half of that in my part 2, there were certain discoveries that I made at the time of things that were happening in the world. I suppose the first one of them was during that same period, Tony Fretton was building the Lisson Gallery, and I was up in it. It's like pre-internet, and we were up in Edinburgh, and so there wasn't a lot of, in terms of how one gathered information. There were 1 or 2 publications where quite quickly after it was built, the Lisson Gallery was disseminated, and it was kind of not just, obviously for many people, but at that particular moment it felt there was a freshness to it that I found extraordinary. I was like, wow, I didn't know what I was looking for, but this is something with vitality. And that was part of, I suppose that was part of my, it's not really self-education, but it was part of the freedom of not feeling so much. But I was taught but that this is something I discovered for myself and I claimed for myself. So it came from no one apart from, me trawling the libraries of the
So no one told you this is a good building?
No. There was a kind of sense of discovery. And I think its value to me was because no one had told me it was a good building, that I was discovering it for myself and it feeling so fresh and surprising, and then coming down and visiting it and so on. I think the second one was, and again this is kind of very early 90s, it was discovering the early works of Herzog and de Meuron, which if I can reach to this one here, which I'm just going to have a little check of the year of publication of this one. This is their project, 1982 to 1990, and it was published in 1990, so I must have bought it pretty fresh off that. No idea where I found it. Possibly, when I was up in Edinburgh, there were no real places to buy books or things, so I would go to the library and maybe there was stuff.
Or
I would come down.
Help yourself.
No. Or I would come down. In holiday times, I'd come down to London and go to the Triangle bookshop in the AA, which was the source of interesting, fresh things. And the book came out in 1990. It published their buildings from the previous 8 years, and I suppose similar to the.
Yes, I was thinking of this.
Yeah, exactly,
this
and
project,
similar to Tony Fretton's Listen Gallery, there was this sense of discovering something for myself. This wasn't from, some tutor saying you should look at this or anything. I no idea quite where. But similarly, there was this freshness and a vitality here that somehow, and both Fretton's work and this work were not quite notionally, but reputedly understood within the context of the art world, and yet they existed completely outside it as well. This thing of being able to discover things, and I think these discoveries that I made of these characters, this sense of freedom to explore and discover, and I suppose maybe something when I teach, I do have a sense that comes a little bit from that personal experience of really prioritising this idea of fostering curiosity. That I want students to. I don't want to serve everything up for a student on a plate. That's not interesting at all to me. I'm interested in their independence, of how they become independent thinkers, and somehow that independent thinking being closely aligned with an idea of curiosity. Curiosity is something that's got delight and passion.
And it connects to you in a library in Edinburgh. Yeah,
I think so. I think that sense of the curiosity that I had for discovering, and it was, certainly my part to the last 2 years at Edinburgh, I had a sense of, through these key works, but more generally, discovering architecture in a way that was wonderful, like discovering a door into a new room in the House of Life that I never knew was there, and that which kind of aligns that passion and excitement from discovery with that sense of curiosity. You only discover the room because you're curious and you want to discover. And to some extent, you mentioned architectural culture. I think that's, for me, it was about discovering a kind of architectural culture. But I think in my teaching, I would try and nurture the broadest sense of curiosity that I can. And independent thinking. When I talk about delight and passion, but I'm kind of keen that students, that there's a certain tough rigour to their curiosity. It's not a lazy curiosity that I think is. It's about the curiosity where you have to work at something in order to scratch below the surface and get.
My question, or this hint at travel, I guess it's more to do with observation of the building itself. And the curiosity, of course, there is something that you have to do. Like, curiosity requires action, but it also requires a kind of direct experience. So I wonder whether. So when I said travel, I meant seeing the building, learning from the building itself. So that there is a degree to which you're excited by what you see in images, but then where or how did you learn to look at buildings?
That's an interesting question, and I kind of I'm going to have to circle around that in the next little bit.
But we could go to that moment. We could go to that moment of you coming to see the Lisson Gallery.
Well, I think
and a kind of maybe the mediated form and then the real form.
I think the Herzog is more difficult and maybe more interesting for it in that I think what interested me at the time, I mean, I'm not unique in this, but what interested me in the time was the buildingness of the buildings. Their very physical presence, their very constructedness, the building of it. And yet, it was all mediated. I did discover them through books and journals and so on, and I didn't see them until years later. I would have said on my part was a kind of discovery of a kind of pleasure in the built over the unbuilt, was actually nevertheless mediated. And I suppose I might go quite quickly over a few things now actually.
Please,
I suppose what I'd say about that is that it wasn't then, it turns out that even though I thought it was a 6 to 12 month moment of window of discovery, it turns out it wasn't. It turns out it was a 10 to 20 year moment of discovery, because actually it took time for me to then leave college and maybe get a job, and then maybe get frustrated in a job of the fact that I wasn't engaged in the build, and that actually it was only years later when I was immersed in building sites and detailing and so on that I could somehow kind of consummate that discovery, that actually the idea of what this represented to me, of the value of the built, only became fulfilled when it was my own, when I could make it my own experience. And until then,
your own experience of building.
Yeah, or my own experience of being on a building site, or working with a building, or designing a building in a way that was close enough that there was a kind of tangibility of the built. And until then, it was the idea of it that excited me, without kind of being able to claim it as a reality in my own kind of professional life.
I do think what's really interesting is that the focus on the building, the moment of building.
Yep.
As almost the purpose.
Yeah.
Is that how you see it?
Yes.
It's the building.
And it's not how I saw it then, but it's become that. I mean, that certainly wasn't what I got excited about when I discovered the Lisson Gallery in these early Herzog and Amorim projects. I suppose what they offered, which was the seed of what came later maybe, was this kind of sense of a rejection of a kind of pretentious expression, a rejection of making a project, that somehow it was a bit more tied in with revealing a project, that there was something about those works that seemed to suggest a kind of closer connection with reality, whereby architecture wasn't imposed by the project, that the projects had a close enough proximity to reality that the architecture somehow emerged in a way that felt less, I can't quite get the right word for that, certainly that it emerged in a sense that had kind of a tangible concern with reality. I'll come back to that in a better sense than that. I think that was a seed that was sowed, and I think that was with the vitality of the builtness. I kind of left, and later on, actually after I left architecture school, I got interested in Kenneth Frampton and his texts and his interest in construction, a medium through which architecture architectural culture has evolved.
Yeah.
That through the cultural dimensions of answering these constructional questions, architectural culture emerges and evolves. And I think that developed an interest in my own specific position or interest in that moment being built happened as I set up my own practice and started building.
Well, I guess so would you say it happened when you experience, you had to experience that process. You had to feel, you had to understand there is something about this process that is architecture, presumably. Is it decisions being made or evolved and kind of a form being adapted or evolving in this process, or is it more kind of the cultural production component of it, or community that comes together to kind of produce.
Yeah, well, it's all of those things. I mean, it's certainly, I'm very sceptical of architects talking about art, actually. I think it's dangerous territory, and yet I'm going to do it. There is this kind of fantastic examples that artists over the last 100 years have set of this interest in process, this interest in prioritising the idea of process as something that's more important than what you do, and somehow the work simply evolves from the process, whether that's action art or environmental land art or so on. Robert Smithson or wherever, there's these fantastic examples, and I'm not going to go too close to that because I think it's just an interesting. I don't think art should be a model for architecture. I think architecture is its own culture, but I think it is an interesting precedent. More importantly, I think that sense of architecture's relationship with building as a verb has definitely a component of the people involved, from both the kind of political point of view of our perspective, as that's the moment where we enter into a relationship, societal, economical relationship, and that's the place where I think architecture, in its direct involvement with the economy, with work, with labour, has this extraordinary political dimension. But I think it's also this point where, with its engagement with the real problems of the building site, with the real opportunities and the reality of the skills that people have, architecture comes into this proximity with the real. This is what I mentioned about those earlier projects having this kind of seed of their disavowal of artifice and searching for some rootedness in the real. And I think that sense of that at the building site, architecture comes into direct contact with how it's actually made, not how it might be made or how it has difficulty made. And by a kind of, I suppose on my part, by embracing that rather than fighting against it and trying to make
how does that then manifest? I don't know, could you give me an example of your project where that struggle manifests in a piece of physical experience?
Well, I think projects are definitely struggles, and it would be naive to deny that they aren't, and they're struggles because they involve time and money that's important to multiple people's lives, and as such there's negotiation and sometimes difficult negotiation in that. But I think I try and work towards a sense of the struggle not being between an imposed idea within the design and how it might be built.
Okay.
I try and align as much as possible what we're trying to do with how it wants to be built, so that we don't get into situations where we're trying to make people do things they don't want to do. That our architecture has, I would say this, but I think people say this of it, some kind of traction in its proximity to commonplace building that comes from that, but not being commonplace at the same time.
When you say that the building process is that space or zone of your commitment, interest, I guess what I was thinking of when you first introduced this idea in this conversation, I was thinking of Carlos Scarpa sketching with the builders, kind of sketching on a piece of paper how some concrete's going to be formed and cast. But actually, from what you've just said, it sounds like that process is actually a bit more embedded in what we know as the design process. It's something that actually happens before the construction process. So you're not necessarily saying that construction process is a space of dynamic change, and I mean it might be, but it's almost that we embody the construction, we kind of preempt it, which we obviously do as we draw the building up and tender it and produce detailed drawings. We preempt it. So I just wonder, how do you think about that? Or do you even understand what I'm...
Yeah.
Presumably the ambition is that the project is delivered as it's drawn, and that we, as good conscientious architects, we have understood the site, we have understood how this is going to be built, and we've presented it, and it's all going to go smoothly.
No, I don't agree with that at all.
No.
I don't think the ambition is that it's delivered as drawn. I see it as a much more open and creative space than that, the construction process, and definitely not in a sense of the Scarpa example per se by itself, although he's a fascinating character in the discussion. But what I think is that I see our projects, but architecture more generally, as a negotiation between that which is premeditated, preconsidered, pre-resolved, pre-understood, and that which is contingent, amended, changed, and so on. And that I think architecture always has been a relationship between those two, but through history there's kind of bits where it's more one and more the other, but an understanding of that sense of that negotiation between that which can be thought before and that which is resolved at the time is a kind of this is what I think our architecture tries to do, seizes the opportunity in that tension.
Okay.
And seizes the opportunity that comes from recognising, let's not try and resolve everything up front, but also let's kind of try and think some things up front, and so that we're taking something to the building site with us, but I would never want to turn up at a building site and say, we know everything, and you people on the building site, your job is to realise our design unaltered. Partly because I think that's completely disrespectful for their role as builders and the skill that they bring to the job, that you want them to have involvement, agency in the process. So I recognise that closes off a degree of vitality, a degree of life that comes from thinking on one's feet, resolving things together in the moment. It stops it from being stolid and staid and rigid. It is a kind of sense that I've got of, the project in its early stages becomes not quite armature, but a kind of frame of sorts that can then absorb a multiplicity of contributions, of alterations, and so on.
But in your work, I see clarity. Is clarity important?
What kind of clarity do you see?
I guess I see a clarity of intention. And that's where I'm really intrigued by your description of the construction process, because I feel like your work often feels negotiated, because as far as I see, your sites are complex, different levels. There's a lot of complexity in the sites. And so, yes, by default, the projects are negotiated, but I guess I see the clarity in the use of concrete. I see clarity in the use of exposed structure, which, structure, it's non-negotiable in many ways.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose there's a sense there of this kind of negotiation of the pre-considered and the negotiated in the moment is a sense of wanting to take something into that place that's robust, that's conceptually robust, that's formally robust, and that's simple enough that it can absorb without getting lost. And I suppose maybe the clarity is there's something to do with that conceptual robustness, that if there's, I'd never have an idea of this project depends on this nice bay window that sticks out a little bit. I'd never think of something remotely like that. The idea that one takes into it has to have a somehow strategic logic whereby it becomes quite quickly a given. The nature of it being strategy rather than motif means that it's got a kind of robustness that can then absorb the negotiated on site, the contingent, the other people's kind of contributions and so on.
I wonder if an example of that could be, let's say, the roof of the Cornwall project, and the fact that there is a point at which it almost it's challenged. The roof is challenged as a roof, and the thin edge, the fact that it doesn't project out, that relationship with the wall. I wonder whether for example, it's something like that that holds the project.
Yeah, I might need to think about that one a bit more, in that building, I suppose, is in the kind of range of our work. It's the one that most feels like a new build on almost a new site. Almost all
Which
of the
it isn't.
Which it isn't.
Yes.
But almost all of the projects have a kind of negotiation with site that's tight, I think. They all grapple. There's no kind of laziness. They grapple with their sites. And maybe that's the one which is least grappling. Maybe it's site. The way it grapples, I suppose, it does grapple in a way in...
Mm-hmm.
It grapples in a way in that it considers the field as the site rather than the specific location, and as such it sees the cowshed that shares the field with it within the same spatial consideration.
And does it as such allow for more clarity or more, I don't want to say non-negotiableness, but it allows for vision that is not as negotiated as in your other projects. And therefore, I think this links to this question of clarity in the work.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the reason why I'm using this project is actually kind of, you've justified my my actual suggestion that could be a project to look at from that
certainly
point of view.
Certainly in terms of its clarity. I mean, I think there's something that I think all of the projects have they all grapple with site and often a very close relationship with the existing. And I think they also, there's a sense of a hopefully nuanced inquiry into typology, and I suppose this project, perhaps more than others, utilises typology as a way of saying something about its context, and as such the kind of typological response has a clarity to it in this respect, that the typological response is part of the grappling with the context. If you're this, I'll be that.
But yet it's saying something else. Yet it's clear that it's not fully built in the vernacular of the site.
Yeah.
So what is that gap? That gap is interesting, I guess.
Well, I think I was... well, that's interesting. You've kind of opened something up there. But I think I was kind of suggesting typology in this respect in terms of building a house within a agricultural field, and this kind of very strong sense that we had of not wanting to suburbanise the house, not wanting to have this domestic territory spilling. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense of reaching out for the courtyard house as a typological solution that has a contained territory, and the sense of the typology of a contained territory being appropriate for building in a field. And I think that was the typological response to the setting. I mean, the question of it's not, I think your question of, well, it's obviously not just the immediate response to its kind of vernacular setting, I think is a much bigger question. And to some extent, I would say it was, but as the kind of vernacular setting might be understood in its very broadest sense, and whether that's, there are multiple readings of that in this building, but whether that's the literalness of the existing cowshed that's only 10, 12 years old, having a profiled metal roof, and the new house having a profiled metal roof that kind of rhymes with how agricultural buildings are built in the 21st century in the British countryside, with profiled metal roofs, or fibre cement, but in this case both metal roofs, or this kind of clay. It's got thick clay blocks that used for the walling without any insulation or cavity, with lime render on the outside and lime plaster on the inside, and this sense that through this wall construction it's communicating with the direct construction language of the barn, which is not an old barn, it's a contemporary barn, but also with the cob buildings that inhabited this landscape over the last 1,000 years, but they're imported from Germany. They're not it's not a local vernacular, but it talks about the contemporary vernacular of import and export, but also of direct construction of the lime render being locally sourced and having some tonal relationship with the soil of the field. So there's a sense of it being a kind of vernacular reaction, but in a very
broad
sense. I'd like to say generous as well. A generous sense in terms generous of
generous.
who it's opening its arms out to. It's kind of opening its arms out to the kind of widest sense, and I think through that, hopefully, looking to have some kind of relevance again. Actually, relevance that it's somehow negotiated between what has been and what is and what might be.
Or in conversation, perhaps.
Yeah, in conversation between an architecture that was, an architecture that is at the moment, and an architecture that might be, that the architecture that we build now and might build moving forward might not be what was built 200 years ago, but also might not be what was built 10 years ago, but somehow is in conversation with them.
If we then think about your urban projects,
Yeah.
there is a certain vernacular there that you're responding to. I have a strong sense that there is a certain vocabulary. I wonder whether you ever think of vocabularies as something that, as an architect, you hold and then you use when you design. I'm thinking of materials that reappear in different projects. I'm thinking of kind of spatial situations, these long axes that are introduced along external walls, and there's vocabulary on various levels.
Well, I wouldn't say vocabulary, and it's just because I personally have a kind of
it's a
I have a discomfort with linguistic analogies with architecture, and so I kind of sense of vocabulary.
And I accept it's a bit of a provocation because I'd like to understand.
There's a consistency between the projects, I think, and a consistent set of interests, whether in types of spatial relationship, and there are certain types that I'm kind of very interested in, or types of kind of constructional logic, and there are certainly ones that I'm interested in. I think maybe the fact that I shy away from the word vocabulary, but also what I think that means, because I shy away from that, and because I nevertheless have these concerns that I keep kind of playing through. I think there's this sense, hopefully, that the projects are fresh rather than rehashed, that each project feels like it's got a kind of vitality that was different from the last project, and yet it can be read as part of a kind of body of work.
Lineage of thought.
A lineage of thought, and that's about reworking ideas rather than forms. Maybe, even though I do appreciate that there's a sense of limiting that is helpful in allowing one to get to the focus quickly. If you cancel out various forms of inquiry, you can keep going in the...
I guess one thing that caught my mind is Mies, a couple of books on Mies.
Yeah.
And I guess Mies is the master of rules, but then actually, or if I'm using word to describe my own thoughts, Mies is a master of a vocabulary that then starts to have this dynamic quality and adjust and change. And is that why you may be interested in Mies?
No.
Or you might not be interested.
I'm hugely interested in Mies van der Rohe, and it's not really an irony, but I'm very aware of the distance between what I do and what he did. My sense of not trying to make architecture something that's finite and defined, which he did to the ultimate, magnificently, but this sense that it was what it was, and my sense of wanting to destroy that sense of fixity, that the architectural idea isn't so fixed that it can't engage with other people's contributions or evolve or emerge from real tangible situation. So there's a complete kind of flip side. But at the same time, I suppose my interest in structure and structural systems finds something in him endlessly fascinating. I suppose that's maybe what that is something about the spatiality of structural systems, which I'm fascinated in. I suppose that's why my projects always have this sense of exposed, expressed structure. I'm interested in the reading of the bones of the building, interested in the seriality of structural systems, interested in their spatiality. But I think also, there's certain of the, even being a bit more literal than that, actually, you kind of mentioned some of my projects had this kind of long views next to a wall or something like that. There's one his Crown Hall in the IIT.
Oh yes, I was trying to think what
has this. There's a drawing in this book that I love, and it's almost better than the building. And it's
so great.
And the drawing, and actually the text that accompanies it, but the drawing talks about this spatial idea of vertically stratified space, where there's one level which is about human occupation, and the drawing, that's where the furniture is and where the people are, but it's also where the windows are kind of obscured because the focus is internal. And then the upper level, which is completely free of humans and furniture and is occupied simply by the structure, and that's where the glazing's clear.
And the world comes in.
And the world comes in, or, well, the world comes in terms of the views of the trees, but also where the ideas go, where you go out, where you're set. Rather than yourself being internally looking, it's also about people being able to project out there, and I find it, and it's something that occurs in a lot of his buildings, or a lot of his larger buildings, this spatial stratification, and it's perfectly developed and articulated in this building, and it's something that it's one of the. If I said there were certain spatial forms of spatial types that I was interested in, then certainly one of them that I think is one of those things that gives a kind of consistency to the work, perhaps without it being too definitive, because it's not too tied to an idea of form. It's an idea about spaces maybe having a vertical upper level.
I mean, there's a sense that you're almost underground, that you're almost sunken, that the level of the world's lifted. I'm thinking about some of your projects which negotiate levels, and actually that there is something of that experience.
Sunken suggests something of the gloomy subterranean world, I think that's not necessarily. I think it is about human. I think for me the enclosure is about human interaction. I think it's this kind of space of lively human interaction. This is a kind of busy drawing, but I think in our buildings, in those lower levels, there's often built-in furniture that becomes part of the architecture that somehow facilitates a way of living, a way of interacting that's proactively kind of social in its intention, but peels away, revealing this thing which is maybe space without occupation, where the structure lives alone.
I wonder if the conversation we had earlier about mediation can come back in an interesting way. It's just occurred to me that many of your projects are private. They're private clients, people that live in those buildings and are intimately kind of related to them. And therefore, those projects are not public. Most of them, we can't see them often. And of course, you've just been nominated for Stirling, and that project was very much seen, but maybe not experienced. I don't know, I just feel this is maybe an interesting question, or an interesting way to think about, or to actually explore how you think about that.
Yeah, I think not all of our projects are houses. Some of them have a kind of non-domestic, non-residential, like drawing matter and so on. But that said, a lot of our projects are. And I think for various reasons, there's definitely this sense of the private in them, or privacy, maybe not. I'm not sure actually whether private is the right word, but no, actually maybe concealed. Maybe I'll use the word concealed
and because
instead of private. It's not about privacy or the private realm per se. But it is about what one concealed. I mean, the project in Hastings, like many of our projects, like the Strange House, my own house that we built, it's kind of invisible from the outside world. There's a facade of the house on the street, but we didn't touch the existing, or we gently touched it, but it's kind of not visible that we were involved. The project is something that kind of gets discovered inside, and similarly my old house, the Strange House, you would discover the project within the site. And that, I think, even with drawing matter, you couldn't see the project at first. It was kind of where is it, and then you either within the spaces or passing through to the valley behind, you discover that there's a building there, but actually there's a reticence to its public face that's not necessarily private, but is kind of reticent. And even actually the nature of the courtyard house is that there's a reticence to its external walls. The external walls have few windows in them. It's deliberately single story and low hung, so there's this closeness to the ground to it, and that actually it reveals itself both in the interior, but even more in the kind of private courtyard or the concealed courtyard. So I think there is something there, and I think it's, there's something there which I'm sure there are multiple strands to.
Well, there is something there that as you spoke, I realized that that's why that idea came back to me, because we are looking at something, we're looking at an intervention that makes the space, that interiorizes the space, and then we can immediately see that there, and then I think about a lot of your projects having that quality. Yes, and then even though your interest and your commitment is in the process of construction and the process of building, the images that are presented of your work are few, let's say, and that in itself creates an interesting relationship to your work. I mean,
there is something connected with your word about interiority, where I think in these projects, particularly the Hastings ones and the Hastings House and the Strange House, I think there is a sense of the project being the site, and that the site becomes an interior, with some bits of the interior being undercover and some bits being not undercover, but there's an interplay between the various parts of the site that kind of is expansive up until the edge of the site, and that one discovers the whole, that internal site when one enters, but only when one enters. A courtyard house being a perfect kind of example of that, but they've all, I think they all play on this a little bit, that it's not that you enter and discover a building or a defined interior, that actually there's a concealed world, and we try and kind of create a whole environment up to the site edges that becomes revealed as you enter this concealed world.
A part of that concealed world is furniture. Furniture, and as you mentioned earlier, furniture is often built in, or it's part of the fabric. Maybe as we conclude, we could go back to the early part of the conversation where we spoke about encountering other architecture and learning from it. I wonder, where does the sensibility and sensitivity towards furniture, not as object, but furniture as a kind of a thing that feels more gentle, let's say. Where does that sensibility and sensitivity come from? I mean, I guess I don't see Louis Kahn.
There is next to your shoulder.
But I'm sure, and the Kahnian joinery and all of that, and Japanese joinery, and there are whole cultures that are centered around joinery, and so I just wonder this world of timber or Nordic. I guess we haven't really spoken so much about Nordic.
We haven't talked about that. I mean, I it doesn't. It doesn't come from Florian Weigel for sure, because I encountered that separately. But I think it does rhyme with these things that he used to talk about scale, where his projects would often kind of say, well, what if an apartment was a city, or what if a city was a house? And there would always be these provocations of scale in his work, where he'd say, what if you thought about this thing in the way of something much bigger or much smaller or whatever. And I think that sense of interplay between the smallish joinery and the city and the parts that play in between, that he talked about a lot. And I don't think I got it from him, because I think I found something in a separate way, but certainly that kind of rhyme, when he spoke about that, I thought, this is kind of this is interesting. And Mies van der Rohe, I suppose, has that sense, and people always say that you can you can understand Mies's idea for what a city might be from the way he makes a piece of furniture. They kind of talk the same language. Actually, when I talk a little bit about scale and timber as well, I suppose there is this consistency in the project scale where they're all about the same size.
Same budget?
They're not all the same budget,
Okay.
but they are all roughly the same size. We haven't done any buildings that are kind of much small. I haven't actually done any furniture, or any big buildings. They're all kind of got a proximity, and maybe there is a sense of each of them having a degree of care that's appropriate for something slightly smaller. I got a bit confused at first when our first project, the Strain House, when people would visit it and they'd say, "Oh, it's like a piece of furniture. You built a piece of furniture in a garden, haven't you?" And I couldn't quite work out if that was quite what they meant. And I think there's a kind of degree of care. We work at this small scale, and there's a degree of care to it that's appropriate for a slightly smaller scale, that then when it kind of plays out at that, has this precision to it.
I guess within the scale of a project, you then want to use, you want to explore scale, and that's why.
And it is, I suppose, we're not doing large works, but the small projects talk of a larger scale at the same time.
I mean, I guess this question of, I've done a lot of work on architects and their influences recently, but I guess I asked you now about furniture scale and joinery, and as you were speaking, I was trying to think, when did I myself encounter that or learn that? And I guess I was actually taken back to my work in a small practice in North London, or at Hopkins, where you actually detail a kind of piece of joinery, and it's there. Like, when you need to draw it, you realize that this thing is assembled and it's complex, and then you make decisions about shadow gaps and joints and
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Louis Kahn a couple of moments ago, and I suppose one of the things that I'm not an acolyte of any sort, but one of the things that I enjoy, that I think our work does share, is the sense of being interested in structure, and the structure having this kind of simultaneous set of relationships where the structure inhabits the site, but then the structure becomes a site for furniture to inhabit. And so the structure in a Louis Kahn building is always inhabited. It's always, something always follows it in the kind of sequence of construction, the sequence of inhabitation. Yeah. His buildings therefore have this kind of interesting interplay between the structure on a larger scale and the structure on a smaller scale. And I think that's something that I, without getting anywhere close to his particular vocabulary or the particular language that he's interested in, I think I'm very interested in that idea of our buildings as structures that have scales of inhabitation, scales of the way that they inhabit a site, even if it's a small site, that they kind of shoulder their way into the site, or even a big site that they somehow suggest communicate with the scale of it. But at the same time, the structure makes a home for inhabitation as it's articulated through surfaces and furniture.
And when you say that you are involved or you are exposed to Norwegian architectural culture or Nordic kind of approach, what do you take from that? Do you take anything from it, or is it just that you naturally speak to that space, that cultural space? Because I guess it's interesting to talk about an architect, but it's also interesting to talk about a space that in some ways you are in dialogue with.
Well, I've been involved with the School of Architecture in Oslo for about 10 years now. I probably started when I wrote a piece on a building by Manthi Kula and met the architect Beata Holmbach and her partner through that. Beata invited me over to various crits and I became an external examiner at the school and I did a PhD at the school. Now I've finished that and I'm back as an external examiner. So I've kind of had a kind of ongoing relationship with the school, going over a couple of weeks to get a lecture and so on. So it's an ongoing relationship and she's a very good friend. And I think there's certainly a sense of interest that I have in Nordic architecture and Nordic architects. And maybe it kind of evolved at different times, you know, through my involvement at the Oslo School. I visited various kinds of fair fen buildings when I've been over there. And as a young architect, I used to go to Finland and visit Aalto's buildings and so on. And certainly, you know, that kind of, there was that moment soon after graduating and then in the late 90s where Britain, you know, partly through Colin St. John Wilson, partly through Cruiser St. John, became more aware of Leverance than we'd been before. And it was kind of I think there was this kind of revealing of this another architecture there at the time that was fascinating and, you know, against the backdrop of English high-tech and postmodern architecture, it was a great revelation. And maybe there's a recognition of shared values, interests in this kind of Nordic architecture that these architects and others more broadly have of a reticent, sober architecture that's nevertheless generous. I think I recognise this sense that it's not that a lot of those architecture, a lot of the architectural culture I meet there has somehow manages to really successfully combine this.
But there's also
variety with a warmth and generosity.
Because there's that element of craft that is very present. Interesting. I guess when I first
I used to really enjoy it, but these things are kind of, you know, influence is interesting. People see what they want to see, I think, a little bit.
People
actually,
project.
Could you reach down that last model?
This one.
That one there, so this is a model of the Strange House with this kind of completely background.
I wouldn't have guessed. I don't think.
And then the house that's kind of within these tight walls with this little courtyard here, and the little courtyard, it feels, in this model, it feels like objects, but actually when you're there, it all opens up and it's spatial. And I had this real sense when I was because we used to live there and I'd have lots of guests, that I was always surprised by what people put onto it. You know, I'd have Japanese friends would come and they'd say, it's just like a Japanese courtyard. A Greek friend would come and she'd say, it's just like a Greek courtyard, isn't it? Or people would say, it's just like Scandinavian architecture. And I always kind of thought, could it really be
everything?
All of these things that you're saying? And maybe it can, and maybe that's part of what's interesting about courtyard houses, that they've got this shared quality through different cultures, resonance in different cultures, and somehow the project tapped into that people could read into it. And so in terms of like talking about being influenced or close to kind of Nordic architecture, I don't know. I wouldn't push it too far.
But I think that's why when you said, I've been involved so much, and actually I know I've read about it, but I guess that my instinct was, maybe that's where this comes from, but it's not.
It's not. No, I don't think so.
I mean, the house was built well before your involvement, presumably. Yeah. So there is some resonance that is beyond real. It's not like you're obsessed with Japan or you're obsessed with.
Although I had been to Japan while I was designing it, so I wouldn't deny that one too much, in that I was definitely steeped in Kyoto temples at the time. But
the Katsura, the Imperial Villa.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't get. There's access issues there, but we went to lots of the smaller ones, things that are accessible. But again, I'm going to kind of pin something on. I think,
well, that's good. That box then I can tick. because that's something that I've always felt. But you say that you don't like linguistic analogies.
I think I also said I was kind of sceptical of getting too close, of architecture feeling it got too close to art as well. I think it's something to do with a kind of commitment to architectural culture and to the built quality of architecture within that I suspicious of analogizing architecture as something else, thinking architecture is art, or architecture is language, or architecture is this, or architecture is that, when I think it's hugely helpful when people think of architecture as architecture.
And then in this, you mentioned the backdrop of high tech and 90s and 2000s, and in the UK, how did you feel at that time? Did you take anything from that powerful movement, or did you feel slightly like not part of that conversation?
Well, I think certainly in the 1980s, the dominant threads in British architecture were high-tech and postmodernism, and I felt at the time I couldn't respond or relate to either of them. With distance, one can kind of engage a bit more now, but at the time, not. But certainly by the early 90s, when I was qualifying, Tony Fretton and Florian Bagel and others were kind of suggesting a kind of alternative strand of British London architecture that was certainly something that I could, that I found succour in, that I could relate to, and I found interesting. And years later, I think the work is good in not directly emerging from that, but being kind of nurtured by the context of it. I mean, there's, London as a place of there's multiple architectural cultures, but also this chopping and changing of it. There are flip sides to it. There's certainly a sense that it's almost adolescent in its kind of need to move on from its parents. Always wants to do the opposite of what its parents did, and it always wants to reinvent and do something different, define itself in otherness from both its parents and its peers, which is kind of to some extent adolescent and kind of prevents it having maturity over time, in a way that, you look at a culture like Spain's architectural culture and you can see, well, they're riffing off the same idea for generations now, and as such it's able as a culture to develop a certain maturity, but at the same time there is a flip of that. There's a thrill of the energy of ideas that comes with that.
Yeah, and so much energy wasted.
Yes.
A lot of energy wasted.
Yeah. So we, as you see in the office here and through there, we work with models a lot, and we don't work with computer renders at all. No SketchUp, no Rhino, don't do it at all. It's all physical. We use CAD to make 2D drawings, but not to create any suggestion of the space. And the physical models, they certainly start out and they're largely a design tool, a way of us exploring space. And I believe that the space that one experiences is different from the space one experiences mediated through a screen, and therefore one reads the real space in a model differently from the way that one does on a screen. And I struggled in lockdown when people I was working with would make a model and stick it to the computer screen and say, look, I've made a model. Doesn't mean anything to me because it's on a screen. As good as a render, because I can't actually read the tangible quality of it all. But I think there's also something I enjoy about models, about their, they're not quite democratic, but their shared nature.
Yeah.
The way that drawings belong to the person who drew them, whereas models have this sense of sharedness.
They allow us to project.
Exactly. Yeah. We each can enter into it in a way that a drawing always feels like it belongs to the person. And I think because of that, whether it's clients or planners or consultants or people within the office, people respond in this much more open way to models that I really enjoy. And I got this one down actually because a kind of slightly interesting story about this. So this is the Drawing Matter archive. We did the main project, which was the archive, which we worked on from about 2012 to 2014 when it opened early 14. following on from that housed, and one half it housed the drawings, and the other half it housed the studio, which was the working space. Adjacent to that were these 2 agricultural metal silos that we did multiple schemes for. The idea at the time from Neil Hobhouse, the client, was that they might house his library of books that would somehow complement the 2 containers of drawings. There would be these 2 containers of books. And we did lots and lots of schemes, and the model shows how we put a new lantern on the top of each, cut a hole in the top and put a lantern on to let light for this kind of concealed world, actually the extreme of the concealed world. And at the time I was very interested in the idea of these concealed worlds, that they wouldn't give much away, and then you'd go in and they'd kind of reveal something. And Neil at the time was discussing with Alvaro Caesar about housing his drawings for the Malagueira project, which eventually he's kind of got, and for a long time we're here. And so at that time Neil was going backwards and forwards to Porto to kind of make this proposal to Caesar and work out how it would play out. And once or twice Caesar came over to see where they would be and so on. So that was great. He visited the building and so on, and we were working on this, and I said to Neil, why don't you ask him what he thinks of this project we've got here of these silos, and whether it should be completely concealed, or how much you reveal on the outside, how much would feel right to reveal on the outside. And interestingly, the answer that kind of came from this, I don't know whether Neil asked that question or a different question, because the answer that came back was, Caesar would love to work with you on this project. And so what happened is we didn't work with Neil on the silos themselves, which by the way never got, the project never got realised. We worked on a separate project, which was this kind of project in between, which was some kind of entrance canopy to them, which as designed was to be something that linked this back space with the 2 doors into each of them, and threaded a link and navigated the levels and so on. And it was great. For maybe 6 months I did this, back in 2015, something like that. I did this great collaboration with Caesar, where I went over to Porto and had meetings and so on. And what the pattern that developed, which was interesting, is I went over and on the first meeting, Caesar, which was 10 years ago now, at the time I thought, he's still going, this is great, and 10 years later he's still going, so it's extraordinary. I discovered this thing that everyone discovers, which is that he always draws, that he's always got a pen or pencil in his hand, and he's constantly drawing, and it's like breathing for him, he's kind of always drawing. It's extraordinary, the way he draws, he thinks. And I was thinking, how am I going to find space in this as a collaboration when he kind of draws like he breathes? It's like constantly. And so we made models. So the kind of way that we worked is that I responded to his drawings with models. I'd go and we'd have a meeting. During the meeting he'd draw and I wouldn't. And then I'd take his drawings and we'd make models, and then I'd go back and I'd show him the models we made, and he'd respond to the models with drawings, and then I'd go back again. And so we've got a series of kind of models of different kinds of sketchiness and roughness going up. I'll show you one at the end, which is a cast model of what this would have looked like in this white concrete. And it was interesting, having enjoyed models for all these other reasons, actually in that moment it became something that felt completely appropriate, and a complete way of making a conversation.
You don't like linguistic metaphors, but it's like your language. It was the language.
Yeah, okay.
That you were...
my medium, maybe.
Yeah, medium.
And certainly it was a kind of way of, not responding to his drawings with drawings.
And why not?
Why not?
Yeah.
Why not respond with drawings?
Yeah.
I enjoyed the idea of the push and pull of different things. I thought that's an interesting play on this. Certainly I think there's probably something in the moment